Welcome to the deep dive. Picture this. You're sitting on your couch, totally alone.
Always the best way to watch a scary movie.
Right, exactly. You're watching late at night, and long before a single monster steps out of the shadows, long before there is any blood or any visual cue that you should be scared, your heart is already pounding against your ribs.
Yeah.
Your palms are sweating. You have this overwhelming, just suffocating sense of dread. And if someone paused the TV right then and asked you why, you probably wouldn't be able to tell them.
Because there's nothing on screen to explain it yet.
Exactly. Well, if you love a good aha moment and you are fascinated by how art secretly manipulates our psychology, you are in the exact right place today.
It really is a profound biological loophole, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Because as a species, we are just incredibly visually oriented. We process the world through our eyes, which means we often completely underestimate how vulnerable we are to what we are hearing.
You let our guard down.
We do. You can cover your eyes, you can hide under a blanket, you can look away from the screen, but you cannot close your ears. Hearing bypasses our visual defenses entirely.
And that biological loophole is exactly the foundation of our mission today. We were looking at a massive structural shift in the movie industry, specifically how Western horror movie soundtracks completely transformed after the year 2010.
It was a total paradigm shift.
It really was. And we are pulling all of our insights today from a really brilliant piece of cultural and acoustic analysis. It's an October 2025 column from Monumental Movement Records, or MMR, and it's titled Post-2010 Western Horror Films and Their Soundtracks.
It is an incredibly thorough piece. The author basically charts the exact moment modern filmmakers realized that the old bag of audio tricks was, well, it was fundamentally broken. For decades, horror relied on the auditory equivalent of a jump scare.
Oh yeah, the classic cat jumping out of the closet.
Right, the screeching cat.
Or that sudden, deafening cymbal crash. The screaming violin that just startles you into spilling your popcorn everywhere. We've all been there.
We have.
But what we are going to explore today is how modern horror completely abandoned those cheap, loud shocks. They traded them in for low frequencies, environmental noise, and honestly, terrifyingly, pure silence. They started using sound to literally erode our inner minds over a 2-hour runtime. Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand the sonic evolution, we have to look at the studio that undeniably triggered the revolution, which is A24.
Yeah, A24 genuinely changed the grammar of the genre. They took horror, which had kind of languished in B-movie territory for a while.
Yeah, it's getting a little stale.
Very stale. And they placed it firmly within the context of high art cinema. And if we are tracing the acoustic turning point here, the MMR piece drops the pin on the 2015 film The Witch.
Oh man, that soundtrack is just a deeply unpleasant, incredible piece of work.
It really is.
The composer, Mark Corvin, completely threw out the rulebook on traditional melodies. There is absolutely nothing you can hum. Instead, he relied on these ancient-sounding wooden instruments and microtones. The column describes the aesthetic as a prayer-like drone, and it just blurs the line between silence and noise until your nerves feel like they are caught in a tightening vice.
Which is such a visceral way to put it.
It is, but why does that work? Why do those specific weird wooden scraping sounds make us feel so intensely uneasy?
What's fascinating here is the use of those microtones. In standard Western music, whether it's Mozart or, I don't know, a Taylor Swift song, our brains are deeply trained to expect specific musical scales and mathematical intervals.
Right, we like patterns.
We love patterns. We find comfort in that resolution. When a composer deliberately uses microtones, which are the acoustic frequencies that fall in the cracks between the keys on a piano.
Notes between the notes.
Exactly. When you hear those, your brain registers that something is fundamentally biologically wrong. It creates immediate cognitive dissonance. It functions as an acoustic warning signal, telling your nervous system that the environment is unsafe.
So the music isn't just setting a spooky mood. It is actively triggering a biological alarm in your body.
Precisely.
And A24 pushed that concept of physicalizing the unseen even further a few years later with Hereditary in 2018. Colin Stetson handled that score, and from what I understand from the article, he wasn't really composing music so much as he was weaponizing instruments.
That is a great way to phrase it. Stetson's work on Hereditary is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He relied heavily on what the column describes as saxophonic drones.
But it doesn't sound like a saxophone at all.
No, not even a little bit. If you listen to that movie, you would never guess you were hearing a brass or woodwind instrument. He completely stripped away the melodic function of the saxophone and focused entirely on its raw mechanics. and the mechanics of the human body playing it.
Right, the breath sound. He captured the literal sound of human exhaustion. The heavy breathing, the distorted resonance of the reed just vibrating violently, and these incredibly deep, slow bass waves. When you watch Hereditary, you aren't just listening to a scary song playing in the background. You feel the heavy breathing in the room with you.
It gets under your skin.
It really does. You feel that bass vibrating in your own chest cavity. It makes the unseen presence in that movie physically tangible to the audience.
It traps the dread inside the room with you. But then in 2019, A24 took that entire dark, claustrophobic aesthetic and aggressively flipped it on its head with Midsommar.
Which is such an overwhelming sensory experience.
Yeah.
Because the whole movie basically takes place in broad daylight.
Yes, the midnight sun.
Right, in the beautiful, idyllic sunshine of a Swedish summer. It is sunlit madness. Bobby Kurlick, who produces under the name The Haxan Cloak, did that score. And if you pay attention, there's this incredibly jarring fusion happening throughout the film. He took ancient Nordic folk ritual music and forcefully collided it with harsh, abrasive electronic noise.
It's an auditory contradiction. Visually, you are processing bright, sun-drenched scenes of communal festivity, people dancing in flowers. But the audio track is feeding your subconscious this dark, electronic, ritualistic distortion.
The contrast is just crazy.
It is. That specific sound design completely obliterates the boundary between a joyous festival and absolute, inescapable madness.
So, bringing this back to you, the listener, what this analysis of A24's aesthetic really reveals is a fundamental shift in how fear is delivered to us. They figured out that it is so much more effective to make you tremble with whispers instead of screams. They shifted the entire experience of fear from a sudden, fleeting adrenaline spike to a lingering, heavy dread.
And that dread doesn't dissipate when the camera cuts to a new scene. It stays in your muscles. It lingers. But while A24 was busy perfecting the art of the whisper and the microtone, another studio was taking a very different but equally innovative approach to modern horror acoustics.
Enter Blumhouse Productions. Now, Blumhouse is famous for operating on relatively low budgets. They are basically the kings of the single-location horror movie. But their sound design is absolutely meticulous. Where A24 went minimal, Blumhouse went massive. They relied on a crushing wall of sound.
You can hear this perfectly in Joseph Bishara's work on films like Insidious in 2010 and The Conjuring in 2013. The strategy there was total sensory overload.
I remember seeing The Conjuring in theaters, and the sound alone is the reason I had to sleep with the hallway light on for a week.
It was intense.
Bishara pushed strings to their absolute breaking limit. He layered these agonizing, screeching string instruments with suffocating blankets of white noise. The MMR piece refers to it as an exorcism nightmare wall of sound. It genuinely feels like the audio equivalent to being trapped inside a collapsing building. There's just no space to breathe.
It is designed to overwhelm your processing centers completely. You cannot think straight. But Blumhouse didn't just use sound for visceral brute force terror. They also pushed the boundaries of how acoustics can carry deep thematic weight. A brilliant example of this, according to the column, is the 2017 film Get Out, scored by Michael Abels.
Yeah, the MMR analysis offers this really compelling formal lens on Michael Abels' score. And I want to be clear here for the listener, we are just presenting the analysis straight from the MMR column. They argue that the music itself operates as a direct translation of social terror.
Right. The author looks at the formal construction of the score.
Exactly. The piece breaks down how Abels intentionally took the traditional chord progressions of black spirituals and completely inverted them. He built them backward into a jazz score. And according to the author of the column, this specific musical inversion was designed to act as a sonic representation of the social terror of structural racism and discrimination.
It is a profound piece of musical architecture, the way the column breaks it down. The analysis presents the argument that the soundtrack isn't just accompanying the narrative. The music, through its inverted structure, functions as an active political storytelling tool. It is a direct reflection of the societal dynamics at play in the film.
It's just a fascinating way to view music as a tangible character in the story, carrying its own narrative weight.
But on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, Blumhouse also proved they could be just as terrifying by removing sound entirely. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about the 2020 film The Invisible Man.
Benjamin Wallfisch composed that score. And while he used plenty of aggressive electronic elements to represent the unseen antagonist, his true innovation in that film was his mastery of negative acoustic space.
Wait, negative acoustic space? How does removing sound actually make it scarier? Doesn't absolute silence just make a scene feel empty or like the audio track just broke? Normally, yes, if it's not earned. But negative acoustic space is the deliberate, weaponized design of the moments where you cannot hear anything. Wallfish and the sound team carved out these gaping vacuums of silence in the mix. Think about the scenes in the empty house or the diner. All the comforting background room tone, the hum of the fridge, the distant traffic, it is all just sucked out of the room.
It's like the audio is holding its breath.
Exactly.
And because the threat in the movie is literally an invisible man, every time the ambient sound drops out completely, your brain panics. You realize that the moments you cannot hear anything are actually generating the most intense, unbearable terror. The silence itself becomes the threat, because silence means he could be standing right next to you.
That kind of acoustic tension is exhausting to sit through, which is exactly the point. Now, while all of this high-concept innovation with dissonance and negative space was happening, the 2010s also experienced a massive wave of nostalgia that heavily influenced the genre's soundscape.
Oh man, the retro synth revival. I always wonder why those 80s analog sounds came back so hard in the mid-2010s. The column really highlights the 2014 movie. It follows as the catalyst for this.
Disaster Peace composed that soundtrack, and it is iconic for defining this era. He utilized these incredibly cold, synthetic bass arpeggios.
And he didn't just use those driving, relentless chords to sound cool. He used those icy synth notes, firing off one after the other, to literally sonicize the fatigue and the panic of being chased.
Yeah.
It sounds like a mechanical heartbeat that just won't stop following you no matter how tired you get.
It heavily echoed the electronic suspense of directors like John Carpenter from decades earlier. But this wasn't just a one-off homage in It Follows. This aesthetic sparked a massive retro wave movement that permanently cemented itself into pop culture with the runaway success of Stranger Things.
Oh, of course.
The score for that show perfectly merged the warm, comforting feeling of 1980s childhood nostalgia with absolute creeping terror.
It's wild how analog synthesizers became the defining sound of a whole decade of American horror. But while the US was riding that retro wave, European art horror was taking things in a completely different, deeply poetic direction, right?
Yes, the European approach during this time leaned heavily into an aesthetic of profound silence, melancholy, and atmosphere. The MMR column highlights Luca Guadagnino's 2018 remake of Suspiria as a prime example of this.
Scored by Tom York from Radiohead. The way the source describes that soundtrack is so beautiful. It calls York's piano and synth work an acoustic poem of loss and rebirth. It was honoring the legendary, aggressive 1977 soundtrack by the band Goblin, but doing it through this incredibly delicate lens of quiet despair.
It elevates the horror into deep emotional tragedy. The column also points to Nordic films from this period, like Thelma in 2017 and Border in 2018. The sound designers on those films utilized these ice-cold drone frequencies. They literally managed to replicate the physical sensation of freezing Nordic air purely through audio. You watch those films and you feel your body temperature drop.
And then there's the 2019 British film Saint Maud. The sound of that movie is described as religious madness wrapped entirely in silence. You aren't getting jump scares. You are just trapped inside the protagonist's quiet, deteriorating mind. Every small sound feels like a fracture in reality.
What is particularly notable about this era is how the boundaries between traditional film scores and outside music culture began to dissolve entirely. We saw a significant crossover effect. Electronic artists and avant-garde musicians who operated completely outside the horror sphere started coming in and changing the rules.
Like Michael Levi. Their work on the 2013 film Under the Skin is just incredible. They use these bizarre, uncomfortable deviations from standard musical scales to make the music sound fundamentally alien. The concept was to make the score feel like an extraterrestrial entity was trying to understand human music and getting it horribly, wonderfully wrong. It sounds like a corrupted file of human emotion.
And this cultural crossover wasn't just about the composers. It changed how the audience consumed the music in their daily lives. The column highlights the massive vinyl resurgence driven by boutique labels like Death Waltz and Waxwork Records.
That is such a cool cultural moment. They took these terrifying, abrasive soundtracks and pressed them onto these gorgeous, heavy, brightly colored vinyl records. They turned horror scores into physical, collectible art. The source even mentions that some of these horror scores became club culture hits.
Which is fascinating.
Imagine being in a crowded, sweaty dance club, and the DJ drops a terrifying, pulsing synth-based track from an indie slasher movie, and the crowd just completely loses their minds to it. It's such a bizarre collision of fear and euphoria.
It really speaks to the universal physical power of these frequencies. And speaking of universality, the column dedicates a really fascinating section to the globalization of fear. Local acoustic folklore from all over the world is now reaching a massive global audience, largely thanks to streaming platforms.
It's amazing how accessible international horror has become. The source points to South Korea's 2016 film The Wailing. That movie uses hyper-local folk ritual music to completely blur the lines between spiritual prayer and raw demonic fear. And it also highlights Japan's massive legacy of using environmental silence as a weapon, citing the classic film Ring.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the fundamental takeaway from this global integration is profound. Sound transcends language. When a filmmaker in Japan perfectly times the absolute absence of environmental sound, or a South Korean director unleashes the exact frequency of a ritualistic drone, a viewer sitting in a living room in New York or London feels the exact same biological dread.
That's so true.
A creeping footstep in a silent room sounds the same in every language. True fear requires no translation.
It's the ultimate universal language. But just as we've gotten used to this golden age of atmospheric artistic dread, the MMR analysis points out that the landscape is shifting once again. And honestly, this next evolution feels genuinely unnerving.
We are entering the era of the auditory uncanny valley. The column uses a highly experimental 2022 film called Skinamarink to illustrate this new frontier.
Skinamarink is an incredibly polarizing, deeply weird experience. The sound design in that movie isn't even music in any traditional sense. It is entirely constructed out of degraded home camera noise, static, and what the writer calls remnants of reverberation. It sounds like an old VHS tape playing in an empty house.
It weaponizes the fear of the missing. Think about the primal terror of being a child, waking up in the middle of the night in a dark, empty house. It is the sheer lack of expected sound, the dead, static air that evokes a deeply human terror. Your brain is desperately searching the environment for an acoustic anchor to assure you that you are safe, and Skinamarink aggressively refuses to give you one.
It leaves you stranded in the static.
Yeah.
But the column takes this concept even further, looking at the absolute cutting edge of where this audio technology is heading. AI-generated horror acoustics.
This is where the science gets truly intimidating. The source explains that artificial intelligence and deep learning models are no longer just analyzing music. They are capable of mapping and mimicking human biological fear responses on a mathematical level.
So they aren't just guessing what sounds scary based on past movies. They are actively calculating the exact audio frequencies that make our nervous systems panic.
Yes.
The column explains how AI can generate an auditory uncanny valley. It creates a soundscape that might seem perfectly normal on the surface. Maybe it sounds like a regular room or a mundane piece of ambient music. But it's precisely mathematically engineered to bypass your logic and tell your ancient lizard brain something is horribly wrong here.
And we have to consider how the delivery method for this fear has changed too. We have moved away from the massive communal surround sound of a movie theater, where you're experiencing the fear with 100 other people. Today, we consume so much of our media through spatial audio and our everyday earphones.
That is such an isolating, creepy thought. The column notes that the fear is no longer out there in the room with you. With spatial audio earbuds, the threat is literally trapped inside the individual listener's ear canal. It's an incredibly intimate, inescapable form of terror.
It isolates the listener completely. You are alone with the algorithm, and you are alone with the frequency.
So what does this all mean when we zoom out and look back at this whole journey we've taken today? From A24's unsettling microtones and Blumhouse's suffocating negative space, to retro 80s synths, the globalization of folklore, and now AI algorithms mathematically whispering directly into our earbuds. Where does this leave us as an audience?
The MMR column synthesizes this beautifully at the end. The cultural significance of this evolution is that modern horror sound is no longer just a cinematic trick to make you spill your popcorn. It has evolved into a highly sophisticated medium that questions our very existence and our sense of safety. These abrasive soundtracks resonate perfectly with our broader societal anxieties, our overstimulation, and our deep individual loneliness. In many ways, the source argues that the noise and dissonance of modern horror are recovering the deep, raw, unfiltered human emotions that mainstream, hyper-polished pop music has largely smoothed over and lost.
I love that perspective. And that perfectly sets up this incredible quote from an A24 producer that the column featured. It really sums up the entire ethos of everything we've talked about today. The producer simply said, "Horror films no longer scream, they hum, resonate, and breathe.
They hum, resonate, and breathe. It is the perfect description of a threat that has moved out from the screen and into our physical, personal space.
It really is. So here is a challenge for you, the listener. The next time you are sitting alone in your house, or the next time you put on a movie, I want you to pay much closer attention to exactly what you are hearing. Listen for the ambient hums of your appliances. Notice the heavy, oppressive silences in the room when the heat turns off. Realize just how much your brain is constantly relying on those subtle acoustic cues just to feel safe in your own environment.
This raises an important question, something that builds on the foundation of this MMR column, but pushes it one step further into our daily reality. If artificial intelligence can now perfectly map and mathematically generate the exact acoustic frequencies that trigger a biological human fear response, what happens when these uncanny valley audio techniques inevitably bleed outside of the entertainment industry?
Oh, wow.
Imagine these exact anxiety-inducing frequencies being subtly deployed in public spaces to quietly control crowd movement, or woven into digital advertising to create a false biological sense of urgency to buy a product, or embedded directly into the notification sounds of our app interfaces to subconsciously manipulate our behavior and keep us scrolling. If our ears have no natural defenses, who is really designing the soundtrack of our everyday lives?
Wow. That is a truly terrifying thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of modern auditory fear. Keep your eyes open, but more importantly, watch what you let into your ears. We will catch you on the next one.